Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. We'll just give it a few more minutes for participants to join in. All right, we'll go ahead and start. Thank you, everyone, for joining this evening for this Data for Good session on how data impacts my life with a focus on gender and data. I'm so excited. I'm Dawn Comer, your moderator this evening, and I'll give you a little bit of background about this, what we're covering this evening, and share our panelists that we have with you, and then we'll get right into some great discussion. So as I mentioned, I'm Dawn Comer. I'm the Director of Technology Inclusion with the City of LA, and I'm very happy to be here tonight on behalf of Data for Good. Data for Good is a Southern California-based organization where we think globally and act locally. It represents community leaders and organizations striving to use data and technology to do better and give back to the greater community. So we know that we have a lot of data enthusiasts out here tonight, and we're excited to engage in this discussion and hear your thoughts about how data impacts your life from a gender and equity perspective. Subhash D'Souza is the founder and leverages a network of public and private leaders to help organizations harness the power of data to make more informed and better decisions to benefit society. On tonight's discussion, this is part of 4 Data for Good data literacy programs, which started in September 2020, where we focus on empowering individuals to understand the role of data and how it affects their everyday lives. Through this series, we share how social enterprises, nonprofits, data practitioners, and everyday individuals can leverage the power of data to better make a positive social impact. So what is it that we're in for tonight? We really hope that tonight we can share the state of the gender data gap and why does it matter. We also want to discuss the effect of the absence of adequate data and how does that impede progress in creating informed and effective policies. And we also want to talk about how we as a community and data policymakers and practitioners, what is it that we can do to improve the situation? So right now, I'm very excited to introduce our panelists this evening. We have Jean Holm, who is the Deputy Mayor of Budget and Innovation for the City of Los Angeles. We have Marie Smith, who is the Chief Information Officer for Data 360. And we have Dr. Anita Sengupta, CEO and founder of Hydroplane Limited. So I'd like to pause a minute and allow our panelists to share a little bit more about themselves. Let's start with Jean.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you tonight. And thank you for joining our Data for Good webinar. And I'm just so honored to be with such amazing women on this panel. I'm the Deputy Mayor for Budget and Innovation at the City of Los Angeles. Before that, I spent 32 years at NASA. So kudos, Anita. We'll share stories later. As the Chief Knowledge Architect, 6 years with the White House, opening up data with data.gov as the architect for President Obama. And then several years in Sub-Saharan Africa, working on open data and transparency projects. And I teach at UCLA.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. Next, we'll have Marie share a little about herself and Data 360.
Hi, my name is Marie. I'm excited to be here once again with Data for Good. I'm the CI and co-founder of Data 360. We help non-technical business users harness the power of big data, AI, and machine learning with our platform as a service. And we work with many different types of organizations, all the way from being channel partners with Google and Microsoft, all the way down to paper napkins, side hustling entrepreneur trying to make it in the world. So we're excited to be one of the premier sources for accessible technology and helping the people who are undervalued and underrepresented access the power of technology. And our focus right now is helping to develop new communities for people of color to have new educational platforms. So we're excited to talk about that as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie. And last but not least, we have Dr. Anita Sengupta. Please share more about yourself and the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me this evening, and it is an honor to share the digital virtual stage with the fellow panelists and moderator. My background is aerospace engineering. All my degrees are in aerospace engineering. I work for the majority of my career for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, developing propulsion systems for deep space exploration and Mars and Venus and Earth entry, descent, and landing systems. I decided to leave 5 years ago to enter the green transportation space, and now I'm an aerospace entrepreneur. So I started my own company actually during the heart of the pandemic called Hydroplane Limited, and we're developing a hydrogen fuel cell power plant for aviation, urban air mobility, and other ground-based transportation use cases. And I'm also a professor of astronautical engineering at USC. And one of the reasons why I went into this particular sector of entrepreneurialism, there's very few women and there's very few people of color in the STEM entrepreneurial space. And so I think that's part of the reason why I'm on the panel tonight to talk about that.
Great. Thank you so much. What amazing women we have this evening. I'm so excited to be a part of this. I share some similarities with all of you. Engineering background, definitely interested in how we can use data better to solve for some of the challenges that we have in our society from a gender as well as a cultural perspective, and always excited to do plenty of projects at the city with Gene Home. So thank you so much, everyone. Let's dive into it. So the first question I'd like to explore is just from your perspective, what is the gender gap and why does it matter? Why are we discussing this evening? Whomever would like to jump in first.
I'll jump in. I think that, it's important to understand the data we collect and what that informs us of, but also the data we don't collect. And so when we start to think about what it is that we collect, especially if you're a data scientist or you're involved in gathering data, that you really need to think about the entirety of the population that you're surveying or that you're looking at. And so I'll just give a couple of quick examples. So we're talking about, recovery from the COVID pandemic. Hopefully, I'm not looking at the next variant, BA2, I think it's called. But as we come out of the pandemic, people are getting their jobs back, businesses are reopening, which is great. But when we look at the impact of who lost their jobs, it's not proportionate between men and women. And in fact, 2.3 million women lost their jobs measured back in 2021 versus 1.8 million men. There's a lot of reasons for that, some of which are that women took the majority of childcare when it became extended and kids had to continue to learn from home. But the fact is that that's interrupted the career. And Anita, you understand this as a woman in aerospace. I feel your pain. It has interrupted career trajectories. It's interrupted the ability for women to kind of get back into their jobs and back at the same earning level. Even in things like healthcare, clinical trials have traditionally for decades focused on a specific demographic, and it's been men when they do the test trials. And then when it goes to production and out into the public, often they find that there's problems because they haven't tested women. And so just in between 1997 and 2001, of 10 prescription drugs that went to the main market, 8 of them were recalled because they had a negative effect on women because it wasn't even tested. It's as if we're blind in some ways to the fact that women and men are different. But the fact is that we don't know the effect of different economic issues, different environmental issues, different demographics, unless we look at gender. And here we are in Los Angeles, look at the spectrum of gender, because things may affect transgender people differently than men, traditional heterosexual men and women. And we want to think of that spectrum as well for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and I have another perspective to add, which is interesting about all the data systems on the internet, which is when we worked on a project called the Women in History Data Challenge, we found that in major databases of 70,000 biographies, the most memorable people in our planet's history, we found that 90% of female figures going back to 3501 BCE were tagged as a companion, model, pornographic actor or social activist, not as their actual roles in society. So, we have a historical, a challenge in remembering history as well for current women and girls being educated, and that's also a deeply troubling factor. There's just no knowledge of modern women and non-Western or in Western history.
And I can speak to a very specific aerospace implementation of this that I deal with quite frequently, as I'm an active pilot and I was just flying a much larger airplane this afternoon, is that when you don't collect data to represent all of your end users of your product, whatever that is, you will end up designing something which doesn't work for them and or is unsafe for them to use. And so as a average height woman, I actually can't reach the pedals in this plane. I have to bring cushions with me. I can't actually close the oil cap. I have to have somebody help or stand on a ladder. So when you don't take into account the data that represents your customer base, you end up having a product which, number one, can't reach everybody. 50% women, right, represent in terms of like people who might purchase your product, and you also could make it an unsafe environment for them. So I think because of the way data has been collected in general to create products in any sector, and because it's being collected by men who aren't thinking about 50% of the population, ends up resulting in poor and dangerous products in some cases.
Thank you all for sharing. I think it also brings to bear the importance of having women in the discussion. So when these decisions are being made about design, we can collect the data, but we also have a need to making sure women are at the table for the discussions and for the decisions. One point that was mentioned about earlier, I think it was from Jean, but it reminded me of, I don't know if you all have seen, but many companies are starting to have returnships for women who are looking to return to their jobs, who may have been away because of having children or taking care of family. But I know that that's important as well, because sometimes when we're looking at resumes and we see a gap in the resume, women have traditionally had to explain what that gap means. But now there are more and more efforts to make sure that there are returnships for those who are coming back to work, as well as I saw and also an effort to no longer have the time lapse in the resume refer to a gap time, but something that's just more amenable and makes someone feel more comfortable to explaining that time. So
John, I think that's such an important thing. I'm on a search committee for a high-level academic position right now, and somebody's resume came up and there was a discussion about whether or not that person, had made a certain level by a certain number of years. And I was hesitant to say, but finally said, it could be that they were raising a family too, right? You wouldn't have, and for the men, for their resumes, it wasn't really a question, but it was like there should be some understanding of the fact that some people are also parents.
Exactly. Great. I think we've covered a little bit about the absence of adequate data, but I just want to see if there's anything else you want to share about the absence of data.
I'll just mention something about what we're doing at the city. So it's not a surprise to anybody that homelessness is a huge issue in Los Angeles and many other cities around the world. But when we look at homelessness, we might have a stereotype in our mind of who a homeless person is who is experiencing homelessness. When we actually start looking at the data and we just disaggregate it by gender and sometimes by age, then we start to realize what some of the triggering causes are of homelessness. I mean, sometimes it's obvious, somebody is no longer in their apartment, so they don't have a home. But 80% of women and children who are experiencing homelessness have been victims of domestic violence. And when you hear numbers like that, when you start to disaggregate the data to understand why many men who experience homelessness are suffering, are veterans, maybe suffering from PTSD, but many women, and partially because there are fewer women veterans, many women are because of domestic violence. So when we get to the root causes of homelessness, some of it's poverty, but some of it is, domestic violence. And so that lets us think as a city of different ways to address that issue, and different ways to provide support and intervention to women who come to a shelter for the first time or who report domestic violence, that these are people who are also potentially on the brink of homelessness. But if we didn't disaggregate the data, we would never have understood that. In fact, the fastest growing demographic of people experiencing homelessness are elderly Black women.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's obviously it's not related to the homelessness aspect, but it's related to the disaggregation of the data. I only learned this today because I was talking to somebody from the LA Business Development Council, and the pre-COVID pandemic, there were a series of programs that were set aside for new small businesses. And after they looked at the data after the fact, it went disproportionately to white male-run businesses and almost nothing to people of color and to women. And so now, because they've reviewed that data, they're making an emphasis for the next go around, which is post-pandemic, to ensure that those communities are covered in terms of having access to these grant programs. So if people hadn't done that disaggregation, then they wouldn't know that all of this money was going disproportionately towards a group that was already overrepresented in the space.
Definitely, disaggregation is so important. Oh, Marie, I see you've unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing is when we do data collection, there's nothing really there to educate those who are collecting the data to look at gender bias. There are all kinds of other biases that us as data professionals get educated on. We get educated on our cognitive biases. We get educated on our cultural biases. But when it comes to gender, there's not a real conversation about, are you including gender? How are you including gender? What makes gender appropriate? What makes it not appropriate? That sort of thing. There's no actual standards out there in terms of how to account for gender. When you're going to school to learn about data, there's no real discussion about how gender and gender equity and parity are accounted for. It only comes up when, maybe someone's doing their thesis or their research or working academics is sort of a one-off discussion, but there's actually no standards or practices either, which is astonishing considering the year, we're in 2022. There's nothing. So, I think that's one of the things to really look at, how do we begin to just sort of think about data collection and how the data systems are actually generated.
Great. Thank you, Marie. I do have a question looming in my head, but I see we have a raised hand. Stuart, would you like to ask your question? Stuart McAdam. And if you're oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Unmute. I think I accidentally raised my hand, but actually as a male researcher, the reason why I'm joining this is because I think this is actually exceptionally important. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a focus on Indigenous issues, but also within Indigenous communities, but also across our country nationally. We also have issues with the representation of women. And actually, because I've come from a background in social science, I'm actually really interested in the lack of historical representation of exceptionally important women within their own societies, and also the lack of publishing about that. So I actually agree with the previous statements by Marie and others about that. But I think it's actually something that I think all countries need to consider, not just the US. And I think coming from a country which is actually a former colony, it's actually a wide range of things that we're dealing with. And often we forget about disaggregating the data and breaking it down into gender as well as ethnicity. Ethnicity is a big issue in our country, but it actually often is one of the overriding issues, and we sometimes forget to consider other issues in terms of gender representation and collection and publishing of that data.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for participating, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
You're welcome.
All right, great. So one of the questions that came to mind as Marie was speaking about the standards for data collection. So I'd like to explore thoughts that you may have about creating those standards and ways that you mentioned, Marie, that it may come up in a thesis that someone's working on, but any thoughts on how we start to standardize that process so that it really starts to take hold?
Yeah, I know what's interesting also is there's a really simple one that hasn't happened yet, which is when women are talked about in terms of profession and the in publications or books or whatever, there's almost no mention of female scientists, engineers, or technologists. In current, when you discuss role models, when you discuss history, when you discuss possible professions, if they show a profession about when people can be a certain profession, they almost never visualize a woman when it's a scientist, engineer, technologist. I've even been known to write editors when they feature business women, and they always feature business women in the beauty business or not in law, not in medicine, not in engineering, not in science, right? Mainstream publications, and it's always about hair care and makeup and those types of things, fashion, flowers, home decor, anything but actual proper professions. So, just solving for that is a huge gap.
Okay, so I have to say a specific thing that's happening right now in popular culture that builds on what Marie said. So I am a huge gamer, and the portrayal of women in games has traditionally been very poor, although that is starting to change. But if you even look at pop culture, like the new Miss Marvel movie, which is really interesting from a diversity perspective, because Miss Marvel is a Pakistani teenage girl. The trailer for that is all about her wanting to have a boyfriend. Like, there was a Saturday Night Live spoof about this. This is a literally powerful young woman from a diverse background who should be stepping into her power, and they trivialize her, at least in the trailer, as if she's, busy getting a crush. And I just think that kind of trivialization is really harmful to the way in which girls can see themselves, as Marie says, as scientists, engineers, aeronautical engineers, Anita, women with the power, as men have too, and as people across the spectrum, the power to change the world. And so it's important for us, even as we tell stories about life, and even as we tell stories here in Hollywood, that we tell those stories in an empowering way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on those fronts, and it's the same in terms of other underrepresented groups. People of color are also not represented in that way, and so it's far worse than unconscious bias. It's a conscious bias in the way things are presented in the media, because they think that sells, because the people who are in charge of putting together these stories like to put it together that way. But it is quite disturbing, and we are making gains in the STEM world. So I think when my mother was in the workforce, although she was not in STEM, I think it was less than 10%. So now I think we're about 25% women in the STEM workforce, but 75% men in the STEM workforce, when you have women who represent 50% of the overall workforce. So there's still a long way to go in the STEM fields. Medicine's making a lot more gains, thank goodness. But yeah, in general, the STEM fields are not making as fast and rapid gains as they should. And I think it's because of the representation of women and people of color, or the poor representation of their inadequate representation of them by the media.
And Don, just to kind of directly answer the question too, which was, are there standards for data? So I just posted in the chat, the city of Los Angeles is one of the local cities who has adopted the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Don, I think you worked on these. So I'll just prompt you to say a little bit more about the way in which we've standardized gender data.
Right, thanks, Jean. So yes, we worked on a project to localize the goals to the city of LA based on our priorities and goals for the city. And as part of this, we use open source data to develop an entire platform. So we have data here on SDG 5 around gender equity, but we also have them across all of the goals. And it was really my first experience and a lesson learned for me on the importance of disaggregating data and why I'm so passionate about this, because it really helps to tell the story. So you can check out our platform, as Jean has shared here, the link in the chat. But part of that work is to really mobilize around the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for how we are improving our opportunities for engaging around gender, around technology, around sustainable, all of our sustainable goals, climate action across the city. So it was a really exciting project, and it continues to work to move on. We engage with community-based organizations who are passionate around this area, as well as universities, and using this as a standard way of telling the story, as well as a way to share where we can do more. I want to go back to the comment around engineering and STEM. As I shared, I was an engineering major. I'm still working in the technology space, but I often always hear that, can't find enough Black female engineers, can't find enough female engineers. And I think to a certain extent, I feel like because everyone I went to school with was an engineer, that I feel like there are tons and many, all over. But I think part of it also is helping those who go to their regular sources of employees, or when they're looking for jobs, sharing with them other networks that have the pools of employees that may be looking, diverse employees that they may be looking for. And I find like that's a constant battle. I feel like I've had the conversation since 1995 about how to find diverse engineers. So it's a little startling at times that it's 2022 and we're still having the same conversation, which is just proven by the statistics that you all have shared this evening, that the numbers are growing, but we still have far to go, so that we don't have this question of where do we find representation in STEM. So
I would say two quick comments about that. One is, what's interesting now is we see that a lot of groups, particularly in Black communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, are finally sort of getting together and supporting each other in getting to networks, because historically there have been no systems or data collection gathering places or job boards that don't penalize candidates for their ethnicity or their gender. And so you have wonderful communities emerging like Fairy God Boss and Diversity in Tech and Black in Tech and different ones that have done an excellent job. And that's just really to show that, a lot of the mainstream portals don't have aren't implementing that sort of anti-bias training. So other networks are starting to fill in the gap. So that is one point of hope in terms of, especially with gender data. With Fairy God Boss, they've done an excellent job with doing that.
And I would add to what you both said that I think it's a choice. So when you don't see representation, it's because the people at the top of the company, of the organization, of the institution are not making it a priority. If you don't make it a priority, it's just not going to happen. You see that in terms with the number of female professors in engineering colleges, right? It's a choice to not hire them. There's plenty of female PhDs that you could hire, for example. So without that emphasis coming from the top, from the boardroom, from the executive leadership, that we need to make diversity a number one priority, it's not going to happen. And if they can pre-select, for example, well, I know I want to hire a certain percentage of people from such and such school because it's a high ranked school, they can absolutely make it a priority to hire women and people of color into these roles, because there is no shortage in that sense. And why not go directly to historically minority serving institutions and HSBCUs, right? There's easy ways to address this, but it has to be a choice. It has to come from the top.
Anita, I couldn't agree more. I watched decade after decade after decade at JPL when I was there, and then later at NASA headquarters, and would watch meetings where there would be one, maybe two women. And it's like this game I play now over and over again in the aerospace industry, where I go, do you think there'll be more than 10% of the audience is women here today? And it's rare, very rare that there is. And so even today, we're still seeing those issues. When I graduated college, my undergraduate wasn't in computer science, but when I graduated, my graduate degrees are. But when I graduated in the mid 80s, 37% of the computer science graduates were women. And that seemed interesting. Now 17% of computer science graduates are women. So not only is it a struggle to kind of stay ahead, but we are falling behind in some fields. And even if we try to sort of like think differently about, well, there's also data science and other kinds of things that may have pulled women away, there's still 100% of people who graduate, only 17% are women. And so I think it's important for us to make that commitment to sort of call attention to it, especially women who have been successful or in positions of power. Even if you don't feel you're in a position of power, my favorite mantra is +1. So bring a friend, bring somebody who's underrepresented, which could be a person of color. It could be somebody along the spectrum. It could be somebody who's really young. It doesn't have to be another woman, but bring somebody who isn't normally at that table so that their voice is heard and that they see themselves as valued.
Great. Thank you so much for this great dialogue. I know we have some questions in the chat. So I'm going to pivot to a question from Anna Capria. What ways do you empower / convince the people around you to do the same? And what she's referring to is putting in the work to make sure that the data you collect and interpret are considerate of gender. So what ways do you empower and convince the people around you to do the same?
Yeah, I'll answer that. The biggest thing we do, as a company is we have to have buy-in from the top of the organization or those who are in charge of the organization, and really as well as team buy-in, right? So the team you're on has to believe that it's valuable. The people writing the checks, the people supporting the initiative have to believe it's valuable. And sometimes it's an exercise in education. Sometimes you really have to go through and start to explain impact, explain why things are different. Sometimes that education might be leaving the organization so that you can go to an organization where you can find the support you're looking for, right? It's not always possible in the organizations, but the key is to, it really starts with you, right? So you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. You have to decide that it's important and then begin to advocate for it in your teams, in your workplace. And you have to sort of put your foot down. I know with Data 360, we have to put our foot down and support diversity versus just becoming like a standard corporate, software company. Right. So we have to say, look, we're standing for diversity. That's a priority. We're going to put the platforms out there. We're going to make sure that we have the relationships that support it, whether it's gender bias or cultural biases or undervalued communities. It has to be a priority, and it has to start with you saying that it's a priority and being vocal and speaking up so that others feel brave enough to do the same.
And I'd just like to give a shout out. I see a lot of men on this call today. I'd like to give a shout out to our allies in helping to make sure that both men and women are represented and the gender spectrum are represented in the kind of data we collect and the way we tell the stories. Because there's areas where men are underrepresented as well. And it's just as important to have gender equity and diversity and collection of that information as well. I think a couple of things we've been trying to do at the city, to build on what Marie said, is we have a workplace equity policy, which looks internally at kind of, are we making sure that people feel included? And are we making sure that people feel comfortable and there's not microaggressions going on? We have My Voice LA, which lets anybody who interacts with somebody from the city report if they have feelings of sexual harassment, and do that either anonymously or by name. And then we also have issues around just gender equity in general, trying to make sure that we've just had every single employee, all 50,000, go through implicit bias training, which just helps each person understand kind of what their own personal bias is in certain situations, because then that awareness makes you more sensitive to what you want to do to be more inclusive and more welcoming.
And I would say for me, it was actually a very personal thing, which I did, which was decide to start my own company. Because when you take a look at the aerospace sector, it's always male founders like Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, and I'm a little bit tired of it. So I decided to start my own company. And I'm now forming a board for my company. And there'll be 2 women and 1 man, and the man is African American. So there are ways that you can actively choose to do things as an entrepreneur to make the company the way that you want. And another way that all of us can have an impact is simply by having the dialogue with the public. So there's a lot of opportunities to be able to do public speaking, science communication, whatever communication in the area that you're an expert, where you can showcase yourself and things that you think are important to you to get that message out there. And speaking to young people is a good way to basically normalize that, to reach out to the audience that you would like to see better represented, whether that's women or other underrepresented groups. And you can make a pretty big impact that way. And there's actually a lot of opportunities for professionals to be mentors for young people, so that you can help people along in their journey, mentoring women to make it so they can be more successful in their careers. And you can be a mentor, a man can mentor a woman can mentor a man, vice versa. So those are ways that you can make very individual impacts in people's lives to help, fix some of the issues that we have in terms of underrepresentation.
Great. Thank you so much. You all are so inspiring. And you just remind me of how important it is to make sure our youth are part of these conversations and can see, who they may want to be. So thanks for just all you're doing, because it's so important. One thing I'd like to ask is, we've talked about it a little bit, but are there other ways that you can share how we're moving beyond gender data gaps and some other solutions that we may have to address those gaps in the data?
So I think there's some creative ways. I mean, one is, I think the most important thing, and I know a lot of folks on the line are data scientists or work with data or consume data or use data or share data, is just all of us as data scientists being aware and kind of helping each other understand when we need to collect data that's disaggregated. We always want to protect people's anonymous data, but anonymized data, but where we need to collect it. And so we want to think about, and I think Lucas in the chat had mentioned that we want to be able to not just have binary choices. You're not either just male or female, but there should be some other selection options to just be inclusive, so that people feel that they are being counted. We saw this a lot in the census, just making sure, as question options became more narrow under this last census. Now, as we do historical comparisons across the census, we're going to start to lose some of those trends in that analysis. And so one is our own awareness, our own kind of responsibility, whether you work in tech or data or you do policy, to be able to make sure you're addressing these issues. And then the other thing, I know that people are finding really creative ways to do this. So I'll drop in a link about some work that some people call it citizen science. I think the better term is neighborhood science. So helping people who are not traditional scientists, maybe not trained by science training, but they're bird watchers or butterfly collectors and counters, and watching the monarch butterfly migration through California and helping to collect science data, but in a non-traditional way. It's an interesting entree to, getting an interest in being able to collect data and understand about science and contribute to the scientific record. And so I think there's a whole group in the United Nations that's empowering young people and non-traditional folks to get involved in science in that way. And I think there's a lot that some of our local universities are doing, trying to help people, experiment with trying different kinds of career options.
Marie or Anita, anything to add to that?
I forgot the original question. It was related to additional things that you can do.
Solutions to help us get past the gender data gaps.
I do think that every company, every institution, every organization has a set of operating policies. So I think it should be part of the core operating policies and principles as to how this is addressed in terms of underrepresentation, whether it's for gender, accessibility issues. So all those things, if it was really just sort of coming down from like, everybody has to consider this in whatever they do, then all of a sudden it becomes normal that everybody gets included in that. So right now, I don't think it exists in that way. If you look at most people's operating, structures, that they would incorporate that. So I really think from a leadership perspective, it really should come from how the company is operated and its operating principles.
Yeah, I think the other thing is we just have to become aware of that biases, there aren't just 2 or 3 biases. And in the paper we worked on, we had learned that there are at least I would say, or nearly 200 basic biases that we have as human beings. Right. And so people really, aren't aware that they aren't aware of what's happening. Right. And so we have to sort of rethink how we run organizations. We have to think about how we generate organizations, and we're sort of ending the age of intuitive, wing it, shooter from the hip, go off the top of the head culture, right? Survival of the fittest, hope it works culture, and coming to a more conscious, purposeful, pre-framed, thought out way of being, right? It's sort of like, so even when we look at the situation in Ukraine, people are going, why is he doing that? Well, he's shooting from the hip. He's want power and he's going for it, right? He's not thinking through the consequences. That's really apparent, right? If you're thinking through that logically, right? And we're just coming off this culture of we haven't been doing that. We haven't been thinking through things. We haven't been, and we're coming off this sort of global cultural immaturity and coming into this other place where we're going, wait, we have information. We know this is messed up. We know this is not true. We know this is true. We know those people are crazy. We know those people don't have the right facts. We know we have this information now. So what are we doing, right? And now there's a whole group around the planet saying, what are we doing? Right? You can't say climate change is real. Well, I can show you 100 cameras that show the data that it is. So what are we doing? Right? And then it's like, okay, you can have people turning a blind eye to it, or you can have the people looking at the video, right? And really wondering how we're going to handle this stuff. And so I think we're really coming on this, it could be a rocky time. It probably will be rocky, but also it can be an amazing time where we really find the awareness of saying, okay, we have all the pieces to collect data. We all have data collection in our hands every day in our phones. We have it in our society. Everybody knows how to do it. So there's a big now what, right? How do we start to handle it? How do we know, whether it's gender bias, whether it's racial bias, whether it's brutality, abuse, war, hunger, climate change, all these things that we've talked about, data for good. We're really in a time of revolution, which I think is really exciting.
Right, great. And you mentioned a great point about just the availability of data and the amount of data that we have now. Some of the work that we also do in the city is around the digital divide and making sure that those who are not connected have access to connectivity, but also with that comes the responsibility of helping folks get online and do so in a safe manner. And so there's a digital literacy component. And I think part of that as well is making sure that when, let's say, for instance, there's a survey that's trying to collect data about a segment of the population, how do we make sure that those who may not be connected can participate and lend their voice as well? So those are some of the things that we're trying to do as well. And we find equally important to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, because we know that there are some who just are not participating digitally yet as well. And then we also have a digital code of ethics where we want to make sure people understand that we're collecting data in a safe manner, and privacy is an important concern as well, because we know that there are some who are not using data for good, and we want to make sure that all of the work that we do around data is done so in a responsible manner.
We actually spend a ton of time actually teaching our clients about how to do safe data collection projects. And a lot of times they'll say, well, just give me the data on everything, right? It's like, well, you haven't asked that person's permission, right? There are disclosures, there are disclaimers, there are things you need to have in place in order to manage people's data. You can't just do what you want with other people's things, right? And the other people's things include their personal information. It is their information. So you have to let them know you have it, You have to know what you like to use it for. You have to give them the option to tell them ask them whether they want to play or not, So we always ask people, when we start promotions or we start a system, we would like to invite you to the system. If you don't want to be a part of it, it's totally okay. If you don't want to respond, it's totally okay. And the funny thing is, when we do that, 90 to 98% stay in the system that we invite them to. And we know, and we're pretty sure, right? Or I should say, we're pretty sure that it's because we ask permission and we disclose what it's for, and we don't change that. We don't violate that credo, and people are comfortable, right? And it's funny that in the beginning of our company, banks didn't believe that that was possible. It's like, well, we should just use the data and not tell them anything. Right? And it's like, well, no, you have to tell them. So, it's real. And I won't say it's a in one of the top banks in America. They said, the analyst said that. So, it's really interesting, how we just, like I said, consciously, if we have conscious systems, we'll be better off.
Right. Yeah. Because we often blindly click that link in the app that we download, right? But when it comes to really knowing that we personally exchange our data, I think there is value in making sure people that we ask. And then, and I love that you're saying that once we do ask, we see that people are still engaged. I think sometimes we're fearful that if we ask, they're going to say no, but they do. We do have a question in the chat about AI and machine learning. So do you see artificial intelligence and machine learning and deep learning along with graph data analysis as data tools being looked at or being used? And I know the answer is yes, but I'm going to let you all answer.
Yes. Well, so that's a big part of running a platform. Graph data and AI data, machine learning data is a huge part of most of the platforms we all use every day in our smartphones and all these wonderful things. And then it's just a matter of, do you know, it's really up to you to educate yourself. I think we talked about this in the last Data for Good session. It's up to you to educate yourself about how to put together your data profiles and know where your data is being used and track it appropriately. But yes, it's definitely a big part.
And to kind of build on that, Dawn, I think that it's really important what your training data is. So if you're training your AI and your machine learning against a data set that isn't good about disaggregating the data or doesn't represent the spectrum of genders or doesn't represent the diversity of ethnicities, kind of back to Stuart's comment earlier, then you're training the system to be biased. And so it's really important to make sure that you get data that's as representative of the kind of data you are actually going to be collecting and actually going to be using for the system when you do the training. Otherwise, it just perpetuates the bias.
Yeah, and actually speaking to that point, one of the things we do at Data 360, our AI machine learning, we do not use regression, meaning we do not, we use what are called classification systems. And so what's interesting about that is regression does have a high probability of being biased because the person training the data selects what is getting trained versus if you look at a classification system, you have a better chance at saying what is and is not so, and then seeing bias because you're building out the systems and how they're structured, right? And so it's interesting when we talk a lot to experts about regression versus regressive techniques versus non-regressive techniques. It's interesting how many people, one of the problems in AI machine learning is that like 90+% of the market is trained on regression. And almost nobody's trained on what's called GoFi, which is good old fashioned AI, right? Which means that there's no sort of scientific thought of the taxonomy or the ontology of the system. There's no scientific rigor involved. It's just training on, binary yeses or nos, or, image data and things like that, which is automatically biased because there is no rigor, there's no training, there's no rigor, there's no scientific method behind what's actually happening. And when AI was done in the olden days, there was a lot of scientific method in many cases about how things are calculated and why they are calculated the way they are. So we kind of have I wouldn't call it we have kind of a apathy for scientific method now happening with AI that we need to fix quickly.
Thank you. We have a question in our Q&A portion. I believe we talked a little bit about how we deal with data, but I'll phrase the question so that we can just make sure we've covered it. But how do we work right now with the state of our data collection and data points that we know have gender bias or gaps? And is it more than just acknowledging our bias? So I know we've shared some solutions around making sure that there are operating policies at the leadership level. Marie just talked about regression analysis versus not using regression analysis as much because it is biased. But are there any other talking points you'd like to add about how we work with these biases and gaps?
I'd like to maybe ask Anita to weigh in on something. One of the things that we have only started recently evaluating is the number of venture capitalists that fund different gendered startups. So and Anita, you must be living this, but a study just came out, I'll post in the chat, that said we're at one of our lowest thresholds ever. Only 2% of funding went to female startups, 2% last year. That is both heartbreaking and astounding. When a woman partnered with a man, it went up to 15%. But for just women startups, it's abysmal. So Anita, I mean, that kind of addresses the question, but I'm really interested in how you're struggling through this.
Well, the statistic, I have been living it, and it doesn't surprise me because oftentimes venture capitalists can be very unpleasant and toxic towards women. And I had one amazing email, which in 5 years' time, I will share that with the public, which was so inappropriate. They explained why that percentage exists the way it does. So I benefit from the fact that I've been working for 24 years in my field, and I have a world-renowned reputation as an aerospace engineer. So I was able to raise private capital from the angel investor community, but the VC community, I think, is where it's the worst, which is where the 2% number comes from, and that has to be changed. And the only way that can be changed is if the funds themselves put as a target that we need to raise like 50% or 40% or some large percentage beyond 2%, which in my opinion is basically zero, needs to go towards women-founded companies. But yeah, it's really bad. And the fact that they don't have that as a priority from the top down is a real issue, right? And I'm pretty sure they don't have as part of their top down, we're not going to give any money to women, right? Because then nobody would actually put money into the funds. And so I think it has to be a priority for investors, people who put their money into these funds, the people who manage these funds. And a lot of them are dealing with their own personal biases towards women, whether or not they think they can do something in this particular area. And I've had people tell me, and I'm an expert and a non-expert, like somebody who doesn't even have a technical background, well, how do you know that you can do this? I don't think you can do this. I don't think this can be done. It's sort of like, okay, but it's a real challenge. And I think there's a lot of gender bias because of prejudice amongst the community that invests in people, and it just manifests in those numbers. And it's not just women too. I think it's probably even less, for people of color. So it's a real problem, and it has to be addressed by making it a priority by the fund managers and the people who put the money into the funds.
Yeah, and I also have a little bit to add to that, having become a venture capitalist recently in the last 2 weeks with Republic. And so one of the things that has happened is, that groups are now circumventing the system. So what that means is that they're just creating brand new funds. They have to create brand new ecosystems and fund other ones because the old ones are so broken. And so, the more that, any of you who are contributing to funds or contributing to crowdfunding or investing in startups or investing in women can empower emerging managers like myself or emerging partners, the better, right? And the more that we can become aware of what, who those groups are, where they're being formed, everyone's still very young in their funds, right? They're newer funds. So, just making sure that you become aware of these ecosystems and you can support them, because all hope is not lost. They are there. It's just a matter of then, figuring out where they are and making sure that you also, like I said, be the change you want to see in the world and put your money where your mouth is, and support those and take the oxygen away from the other. Right. So.
And it's fascinating because those funded 2% are much more successful than male startup businesses. So it's even like illogical for them to have that bias. It doesn't even make sense from a venture capital perspective.
That's why I think the new systems are happening. It's because it literally is saying, we're not going to change these guys. We have to go into like a whole nother direction and start to put our powder in other places. So it's amazing. And there's lots of stats that say women are better at all kinds of things than their male counterparts when it comes to business organization, strategy, science. I mean, so many different biases, right? So it's I'm hopeful, but yeah, we definitely have a long road to go.
Great. Thanks, everyone. This has been such a rich discussion, and I know we can continue for many hours this evening. I just love the rich experience that we shared, the questions that have come in, and I hope that everyone who's participated tonight has learned something new, heard something in a different way, and we'll take this fire and move it forward so that we can eradicate the biases and gender inequities that we see, that we can collect data in a better way, than that we can use the data to tell the stories of those whose voices that haven't been heard. So I want to take time and just say thank you again to Anita, Marie, and Jean for joining this evening. I thank you to everyone who asked questions. Please do take some time to participate in the poll that's on your screen right now. And we're just so thankful that you've been here.
Thank you, Dawn, for moderating.
No problem. It's been fun. We have a lot of work to do, but we have a lot of good that is already happening.
Go forth and gather that gender equity data.
And support women, invest in women.
Yeah.
Hashtag.